The intimidated people didn't come.
Hmm?
I said the intimidated people didn't come.
Perhaps. So, one of the things that Jennifer had asked me was what would be the prerequisites for an advanced shell scripting class. And I gave that some thought. I didn't actually answer her question in email, but I did give it some thought. So I've listed them here on what would have been slide 1 had I actually gotten the text of my slides into an actual formal slide presentation. Everybody knows how to assign variables. By the way, when I'm talking shell scripting, has everybody here heard of the C shell programming considered harmful document? Okay, so I don't talk about shell scripting in C shell. I use C shell only a little bit when I have to. It turns out right now I work for a company that makes EDA tools. And for some reason, every EDA tool user in the world seems to use C shell. And there are a whole bunch of systems in my work environment where we don't even have a usable copy of Bash. Yes, so disgusting as it sounds, I actually have C shell with a .login that searches for a usable copy of Bash, KSH, or ZSH and execs it if it can find it. All right, so I still end up in C occasionally. But anyway, in your born compatible shells, you set variables, var equals, and a value. Anybody here know what happens if you put a space on either side of the equal sign? It just doesn't work. Yes?
I was going to say, in a conditional, it's pattern matching.
I was talking about in assignment, which is the first prerequisite here.
Depends on the name of var.
What depends on the name of var?
What's going to happen if you put a space before the equal sign and your var, the variable in question is named, say, ls, you'll run ls.
Yes. What I'm saying is it will not work as an assignment.
There is that.
Right? And that's one of the things that's... The shell is very quirky about spacing, about where its arguments are, things like that. So if your value has any kind of spaces in it, you know you have to put quotes around it. We'll talk a little bit about quotes. Now, the second form, of course, is one where, it's one of the more common ones. Everybody recognizes that $paren is effectively the same as backticks. Now, if you find an old enough copy of Bourne Shell, you might actually find one that does not support the $paren form.
Hey Jim, could you make that font bigger?
Could I make the prompt bigger?
Font.
Well, it's already huge.
Not out here, it's not.
Okay, well, let's see if I can just switch to a lower resolution here. In the, well, no, that's the only one I've got here. I could try extra huge. I don't have an extra huge.
X font cell.
Yeah,
Yeah, we don't need that.
Huh?
Is this KDE?
Huh?
Is this KDE?
This is whatever SUSE 10.1 gave me by default, so.
If you use something else than next term, it'll make it bigger.
Yeah, I'll do xterm fn, let's try 12 by 24, e.g. black, SSB, FG. Everybody like green as a foreground? Is that okay with everybody?
Sure. It's just very traditional.
Dash CR red. Cool.
That's somewhat better.
Is that like Solaris?
I should probably change my host name too, but I'm not going to bother. Okay, so. Okay, so as I said, the $paren is an alternative form of the backticks. The nice thing is that it's nestable. The only disadvantage is if you want to write a shell script that will run in any bourne-compatible shell, then you won't be able to use this one. You have to use the backticks instead. And if you're using backticks, that means that you might have to do some kind of additional quoting. By the way, if the command is going to generate any spaces, then you better put quotes around it, double quotes, like so. Which brings me to my first tip. Oh, excuse me.
Possibly not like that.
Yes. Which brings me to my first tip. When I'm shell scripting, I put double quotes around every variable reference unless I absolutely am positive that I really do possibly want it to expand into multiple arguments. Putting double quotes around it is the default, and I think about it twice before I ever put in any kind of $ or variable expansion that might possibly, in the wildest imagining, have a space in it, or a tab, or a line feed, or anything else. Alright, and then another prerequisite, you pretty well have to know what the read command does. So, of course, it's a way of assigning variables. It's the only other way to assign variables other than with an equal sign. How can you tell that read absolutely positively must be a built-in? Why can you not possibly implement the read command as an external command?
Because it launches the shell.
Almost.
Because it sets unexported variables.
Well, it's not even that it sets unexported variables, it's that it's happening as a separate process. In order to assign a variable is in my address space, in my process. Only built-ins can modify my own address space. Any external command I run, the shell forks off a child, which execs that, and it only has access to its own environment space.
Isn't that what I said?
I don't remember exactly what you said, but it didn't sound quite right. And what she said definitely is not right, because one of the things that I've found that confuses people about shell variables and environment variables more than anything else is there's this hidden expectation by a lot of people who are attempting to do shell scripting that somehow an exported shell variable somehow magically becomes an inter-process communication mechanism, and somehow a sub-process should be able to modify it. Well, it can only modify the copy of it that it inherited in its own address space. It doesn't actually get to do anything to the parent's address space. That's why you almost always have to use the backticks, or command substitution, $parent. Incidentally, in my writing, I almost always use the $parent form because it's a heck of a lot easier to tell what you're talking about than having to squint at the screen and say, is that a single quote or a backtick? The two are often kind of confusing in many fonts. Now there's one thing, when I'm teaching my classes in basic Unix and Linux systems administration, there's one thing where I don't have this connected to the net, or I'd show you a neat animated graphic that Heather cooked up for me once, but I'll just draw it on the screen here real quick. And this is just a piece of review, but a lot of people it kind of comes as a new revelation to them. So when I first say something like foo equals bar, if foo had not been set before, then it is initially instantiated on the shell's own local variable heap. Any subprocesses I create from there will not inherit a copy of that because it has not yet been exported. So let's just talk about that for a second. I run the ls command. What happens is fork. A new process is created which is conceptually an exact copy of whatever I had in my space. And then, now this is a copy of my shell, but then immediately after that, there's an exec of the ls command. What the ls command, or the exec rather, does is it wipes out almost the entire address space that I had. The only part that did not get wiped out was the environment. So maybe now you understand why the keyword to put something in the environment is export. Because when I do an export of foo, then it moves it out of the part that's going to get overwritten by the exec. It exports it out of my executable address space and into this other piece of magic memory. Very simple concept, right? So read could not be an external because what would happen is I'd end up forking, I'd exec some mythical read command, it would modify its own environment, and then right after that it would exit, and that would be gone, and I wouldn't get any change up here. So how many people already knew that?
Which specific part of that?
Okay, so I imagine most of you kind of understood the concept that read has to be an external and you couldn't modify your environment from a child. But how many people actually had ever seen that picture or that had that pictorial concept of why that was the case?
Do you mean to say read has to be an internal?
Yes, read must be a built-in. It cannot be an external because it has to modify your own address space. Now, every other command that manipulates variables in the shell checks the environment first. And if it's in the environment, it modifies the copy that's in the environment. So under normal circumstances, you'll never have duplicates in the environment and the heap. The shell won't let you do that. There is no syntactically correct thing that you can do that would make that happen. Now, it's possible for a C program using lower level APIs to actually create duplicate duplicate environment variables. It's very rare, but I've actually seen some security bugs, like on BugTrack, where a program depended on the notion that the environment was clean, and it would scrub one copy of an environment variable, but the exploit in that case had deliberately put in an extra copy of a dangerous shell variable. So the attempt to scrub it was incomplete. Then the next subprocess ended up relying on a bogus $home or $env or $lc_locate or one of those bazillion other magic environment variables that cause security researchers nightmares and are the delight of every cracker. Okay, so that's the read command. Now, how many people here are familiar with the set command? How many people have used it? Okay. Do you realize there are 3 different personalities to the set command? If you just type set with no arguments and hit enter, what happens?
It's unexported variables.
It actually shows you a list of both your exported and your unexported variables. So the reason why print env and set, why the output from those two can differ, is because the print env command, which is an external command in almost all cases, is actually only printing the environment, the exported list. The set command is printing all of the variables it knows about, and under bash it will also print shell functions. I don't remember whether it does aliases, but it prints a few other things besides just variables. So that's an unusual thing about it. So that's one function that the set command does. Does anybody know? Just go ahead and throw it out. What's the other thing? The second most common use of set.
Set your argument. Set your argument list argument.
Right, reset your argument list. So if I say set, now normally it's wise to do set -- space and then whatever you want to replace $1 and $2, etc. When you do that, you're replacing your existing positional argument list with a new set of them. And then the last function is for doing things to set certain runtime behaviors of the shell. For instance, if on the second line or somewhere in my script I say set space -x, then for there until I turn it back off, then I will get a trace. Every command before it's executed will have usually a plus sign. If it's nested, it'll have a couple of plus signs, etc. That's a really handy debugging trick. Is in the place somewhere around where you think you're having a problem in your shell script, put a set-x. Then somewhere after that, you can turn it back off when it gets too verbose, and it will trace through your script. There's a couple of other ways of doing that, but I'll just give you that one. So those are the three totally different functions of the set command. Another prerequisite, I hope you all know what basic filtering is, piping. I'm going to give you an example here. This is one of these little tricky questions. It's the sort of thing that if somebody comes to me and tells me that they are just really hot when it comes to shell, they know everything there is to know about shell, and I'm supposed to be interviewing them for a job or something, then I say, oh, okay, well, I have a question. What does the following, oops, incidentally, this particular system is multinational, so every time I accidentally hold down the shift key and the space at the same time, then it goes into kanji mode. So, what does that do? Anybody want to venture a guess?
Sets foo equal to bar and then prints bar.
Well, no, that kind of depends on which shell you're in.
Talking bash.
In bash, this will echo nothing. In corn shell, it will echo bar.
Okay, why?
Good question. And, you know, I don't mind if somebody can't answer this, but I do love it when they can figure out how many processes are involved in this.
2, 4, 3. 2 echoes in the shell.
Well, in bash, the echo command, actually there are only 2 processes, and in this
echoes
particular
sorry.
case, there are no execs, because it turns out that the echo in bash is an internal command, and so is unset, and so is read, of course. So all of those are internal commands, so there are no execs here. But whenever you see a pipe, you've implicitly created a subshell. It's an inter-process communications mechanism. Interesting thing, which side of the pipe is the subshell on? Well, now that's actually not specified as far as I know by POSIX. So you're allowed to do it whichever way you want. Corn shell 88 and 93 do what I think is the more sensible thing. They put the subshell on the left of the pipe. So they're reading into the current process. We're going to see in a second why I think that's much nicer for certain purposes. But older versions of corn shell, old versions of bash, and ASH, current versions of bash, all put it on the right. So that's why this echoes nothing. If I start up a copy of KSH, I don't have it. Do I have PDKSH installed? No? All right. Well, oh, I'll use Zeesh, which I happen to know Zeesh does the same behavior. So if I say unset foo, echo bar, pipe, that doesn't work very well. Excuse me?
You got some embedded kanji stuff before the read.
I must.
Yeah, that's cute.
Some non-printing stuff. Okay, so still doesn't like it. Unset foo, echo bar, pipe, read foo, echo dollar foo. So as you can see, Zeesh, exact same command, it's reading in from the before the pipe into the current process. Okay. Everybody here knows about the ampersand and pipe, the double ampersand and pipe operators? Anybody doesn't? Okay, so both of these are conditional execution. The condition is based on the exit value of the previous command. And so if it's 0, then amper is true, so whatever is after that will be executed. If it is false, if there was a non-zero exit value, then a pipe would be executed. Now when you're chaining these together, you obviously have to be very careful, because if I have a command like this, another fictitious command, foo, amper, amper, bar, pipe, pipe, baz. Baz. I'm not actually going to execute that because I don't have commands foo, bar, and baz on here. But if the foo command succeeds, then bar will be executed. But if either of those fail, then baz will be executed. So it's not the same as an if-then-else. Because of that little gotcha here. If bar fails, then baz is going to get executed as well. If both of them succeed, then baz will never be executed. And you can use command bracing and parentheses and other funny things to affect that. But as soon as you have to stop and think about it, it's time to reach for an if-then-else phi. I hope everybody here is familiar with if-then-else phi and case and ESAC. KESAC, of course, I mean ESAC is case spelled backwards, and phi is obviously if spelled backwards. That was Stephen Bourne's sense of humor. I heard that he got that from some earlier programming language, like, yes, Algol.
He did Algol macros to write board shell.
Yes. Okay. Now, there is a repeat until version of the while do command. I find that I almost never use it. Pardon?
He said, I've always been glad it's not do odd.
Yes. Yeah, well, that would give the octal dump command fits. Or at least give us fits when we're trying to use it.
It would be a built-in, it would override.
I mean, depending on what you did, yes.
We'd have to spell
The other thing that you absolutely have to know as a prerequisite is, of course, $1 through $9. Now, this form here is, you see, after the original version had been used for a little while, they thought to themselves, well, sometimes people need arguments beyond $9, and maybe shifting them out of the way and everything is a little bit of a hassle. Let's come up with a way to let them access $10 and $11. Oh, but wait a second, we've already got a legacy of people who already used $1 and may have appended something after it. So that creates an ambiguity. So now we have to put braces around it. If you're going to have more than one digit in here, you put the braces around it so that it does not get interpreted as $1 with another digit appended to it, for example. Yes?
And that's not portable. The $11 is not going to be portable to a real Bourne shell.
Yes, to an old Bourne shell, that will not work. Exactly. If you really need to write scripts that will run guaranteed on every Bourne shell from the beginning of time, then there are a whole lot of little things that are going to bite you. And so what you're going to end up having to do, what I personally as a practical matter recommend is on a typical Linux box, there's a copy of a shell called ASH. A-S-H. This one is about as close to the original Bourne shell as you're going to get. It's going to have most of the limitations. Not all of them. I think ASH will recognize the $11. We can test that real quick. ASH, set dash dash 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Echo 11. Yeah. So,
It goes to 11, Jim.
I know, I said.
It's good. It goes to
But
11.
won't you just get the same thing? You said tell echo $11.
Let me change that to something else. How about if we use, I'm glad somebody else thought of that. I was thinking of myself, but I thought, okay, why don't we go 20 through 35. We'll make a whole bunch of them. Okay, now first of all, if I say echo $, we see that I have a whole bunch of those. And if I say echo $brace 11, then that looks right. Okay, so thanks for catching my possible error in logic there. So as I said, ash is a good way to test it against kind of most shells. And by the way, later versions of the Bourne shell had added that anyway. So, I mean, you'd have to find a really ancient version of Bourne shell to not recognize dollar parent and the braces that we described there. Yes?
So I was setting up a cron job on a Solaris, I think 8 machine, which runs, I forget whether it's SBIN-SH or BIN-SH. And I tried to do command, amper, command. And it said amper not found. So I ended up doing not command or command B. And I thought it was the most brain-dead thing in the world.
The version of Bourne shell that ships with Solaris at least as late as 8, and I think I heard even 9, is notoriously limited.
Okay.
So, yeah, do an exec of KSH.
I said worse things than limited when I experienced it.
Yeah, that's true. If you have access to a Solaris machine, testing with its version of shell is useful as well. Okay, so anyway, those are prerequisites. Now a couple of other things. $, quote dollar at, dollar pound, dollar bang.
Some freeware.
Does everybody know what all those are? I'll go through them really quick. $, we just saw. This expands to your entire list of positional parameters. The one trick, though, is that in this form, it reparses them. So if I had something like, it's my favorite example for this, set dash dash 1, 2, 3 space 4, for I, do, echo, $I, done, we see that the shell considers this as 3 different arguments, one of which just happens to have a space. Right? This is exactly the same as for I in quote $at. Do echo $I, done. However, if I change this to a $, we see that it reparsed it. And if I was silly enough to do something like this, which is almost never what you want, it treats it as just a single argument. Because it was expanded inside of a pair of double quotes, and now the for command had to parse it as just one argument. So the quote $at, by the way, $at without the quotes around it, it's just the same as $. It parses and redoes it. In fact, I'll even just show you that. Notice, by the way, that when you're playing with the set command, you can do a lot of things just right at the shell. You know, most people have never thought, oh, gee, I could just reset my interactive shell's positional parameters and use them. So anyway, as you see, $at and $* with no quotes around them are exactly the same thing. But double quote $at is magic. And this is actually really handy. Because sometimes I want to do a whole bunch of parsing, and using a bunch of string parsing and command substitutions and greps and cuts and other things gets ugly. I don't like doing it. But I'm going to move a little further before I go into that. Okay, a couple of other things. Some other magic shell variables. $pound is the current number of positional parameters. $bang is the PID of the last process you started in the background. So if you start a process in the background, as in you tack an ampersand on the end of it, then you can immediately thereafter, you can catch BG equal, or whatever you want to call your background process. I usually call it BG as a variable name. So my BG or BG proc equals $bang. And so I can actually create an array or a list of these if I want, which can be handy if I want to. Later, I may start a whole bunch of background processes, and at some point, I want to wait until they've all completed before going on. Give you an example. I wrote a backup script for somebody, wanted me to back up a whole series of about 90 machines. He only had small subdirectories of them that were being modified. The rest of them was just the OS. So he wanted all of those synchronized to a set of subdirectory trees on one machine, and then he wanted to do a take backup of the one machine. So I spawned off, I had a big file, and I said, for each line of this file, read it in, break it up. The first argument is a host name, the second argument is a source directory, the third argument was a local target directory. So for all of those, rsync in the background, spawn it off, and then I did a couple of tape manipulation commands to rewind and retension the tape in the background, and then I just did a wait command. And the wait command is probably the most underused command in shell. It simply waits until all background jobs are completed. But sometimes you might want to wait on a specific job, or loop through your list of jobs and wait on them one at a time and catch their exit values or something. So that's what you'd use $bang for. Keep the list around, and then you can use the PIDs yourself. $question mark, everybody know what that one is?
Exit status of the last.
Exit status or result code of the last thing you executed. You better catch that right after the command you care about, because the next echo you do is going to have an exit of 0. And $ifs, now there are about a bazillion other magic variables, and each shell adds new ones. Each new version adds new ones. But $ifs is one of the oldest ones, also one of the most useful. It's the interfield separator. So when we talk about things like how the set $* reparses, reseparates your arguments into a list, then it does so using the IFS value. So if I do something like this, notice that it reparsed those because a colon now became an interfield separator. By the way, bash, when it reparses, it takes the first character of your IFS and replaces all of the IFS values it finds with those. Kind of a weird thing. I'm not sure, I haven't tried this, so this might or might not work. If I try reversing these, nope, still spaces.
Take out the space.
I think it may still put, well, let's see. No, it still parsed them.
It's a good thing it recognized the space in your command.
Oh, well, now there's an interesting thing. There was an old version of Bourne Shell that when you set your IFS value, it would then require you to separate all your words on your command lines using something out of the new IFS value. However, Bash and pretty much all newer shells do not do that. They don't apply it to the actual script or the interactive shell. They only do it when they're reparsing arguments. They don't do it for command lines themselves. It's kind of a quirk. Okay.
There's a gotcha on the $question, which is that test and bracket, left bracket, are actually programs.
Of course.
And so if you don't watch out, you'll end up getting the return value of test rather than the thing inside test or something.
You absolutely will. That's exactly what you expect. So one of the things, I've forgotten your first name. Rich. One of the things he pointed out, and most people don't realize this, the square bracket traditionally is actually an external command on a Linux box. It's named /bin /square bracket. Now it may also be a built-in, just as you still have a bin echo, but you're almost always using the built-in version of echo. Printf is often a built-in, and it's always an external as well. This thing here is usually just a symlink or a hard link to the command test. So whenever you see things like this, if -z $foo then whatever, then you're actually running an external command, or a built-in, but it behaves as a command. That's one of the reasons why if you don't quote this thing, then it's going to give you invalid number of arguments. -Z requires an argument. Because it's behaving just like any other external command would when it's trying to parse its arguments. Now, when you're using this, when test is invoked by square bracket, then it will keep parsing and typically complain if it doesn't see the closing square bracket. That's just another one of those little gotchas.
I think it's cute.
Test requires a closing bracket?
No,
No.
the left bracket.
When it is invoked under the name. So basically the code of test looks something like, if $0, if base name of $0 is square bracket, then look for the closing bracket and complain.
And don't name your test scripts test.
Well,
That's true.
you can, just as long as you're willing to use
And it's
/ for every invocation of it, you'll be fine.
No, it was the running out of processors part that killed me.
I have never managed to do that, but then
I
Jumped
didn't
up
name the
before Ben
program
told her.
test. She named the program test, and her program named test called my program that used test. We ran out of processors.
All around the memory, just in memory.
Okay. So, having gone through the prerequisites, let's go into some other stuff. I'm going to try and do this where I propose what the problem I'm trying to solve is, and then one solution. I am painfully aware that there are many, many solutions to just about any problem you can state. Who was it that had this maxim that for every problem there is a simple, elegant solution? That's wrong.
That's what economists say about the classicist branch.
The who, what?
Economists say about the classicist branch is that for the classicists, every economic problem has a simple and elegant solution, and it's wrong.
Isn't that a reduction of every program has a bug, and every program can be reduced by at least one instruction? And so by that logic, then you get that conclusion, which is every program can be reduced to a simple program.
That has another bug, yes. All right. So, I actually got this one time as an interview question. This is a true story. Guy wrote this up on the board, ps-lax, pipe, grep, foo, pipe, blah, 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 blah. And I wasn't sure whether, how much detail he wanted me to get into, as is the case in a thing. My internal thought was, what isn't wrong with that command? I understand what he's trying to do. Everybody understand what he's trying to do? Go through the process table, find a command, foo, kill it. Okay, simple enough. First thing I asked him was, well, every time I use a PS command and I'm intending to do something dangerous, like kill something based on what I'm looking at, I actually do a little PS command with the same arguments on the same machine I'm going to do this to and count, just to make sure that any of my, column listings are correct. I'm a little.
You wouldn't deal with an awful lot of completely different machines and operating systems, would you?
And I can't. I mean, my mind is full of a lot of trivia, but that's below the threshold of trivia that I allow to leak in there. Okay. So that's the first thing, and then I looked at him and said, "So is that what you were looking for?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, okay." He said, "But it sounds like you have more." I said, "Oh, yeah. All right. I'll tell you the rest." So, first thing is, when you're using, this was specifically a Linux interview, I should point out. When you're using BSD-ish switches on a PS command in Linux, it will complain if you use dashes in front of it. That's just a nitpick, really. The regex, one of the things that when you're trying to do PS pipe into grep, you should always wonder, is it going to find my grep process before it finds anything else?
It almost always does.
And it used to be kind of more of a race condition of whether the PS had managed to buffer up enough of the process listing before the rest of it got added,
It
or...
doesn't really hurt because by the time you kill it, it's already run.
Well, except that you may have killed your grep before you found the next thing you were killing. Yeah.
But then at least you
Been there,
didn't kill
done
anything.
that, got the t-shirt.
Yeah, exactly. So I pointed out that you could, if you really wanted to, use square brackets around the first character, the first static character in your regex, and that will actually only match foo and not F square bracket foo. Thank you. But I also pointed out to them that there are news groups where they give out this thing called the Useless Use of Cat Award. That's when you use cat and you don't need to. Now, personally, I think that giving out the, quote, useless use of cat award is egregious. Because a lot of times a command is just plain easier to read. If you see the cat at the beginning of it, you know what's going on. If you're parsing through some convoluted piece of magic that somebody's come up, and you have to go typically all the way to the end of it before you find the little less than and the file name, then you just made yourself work harder, or at least whoever did that little piece of cryptography made you work harder to find out what's going on. But I do consider the use of grep to pipe into awk to be useless. Awk has a perfectly good regex engine all by itself. If all you were looking for was, now I'd understand if you were using some of the more sophisticated, you know, extended regex stuff, or some of the neat, right, some of the neat stuff you can do with dash capital A or context or whatever. There are cases where using grep to feed into awk makes sense. This isn't one of them. And then I said even awk and xargs are overkill for this. You don't actually need them. Now, it's not ridiculous. I mean, it's still shorter than a lot of the other variants. The other problem, of course, is that you're going to find foo even if it was in one of the arguments of one of those commands. So there's a little problem with that too. So here's a couple of examples. And this is the only shell construct that I have ever actually given a name to. I've never read this in a book anywhere, but I call it the pipe mill. So an example, PS, and whatever your switches are, while, and then read, and blah, 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 blah. Now you look at all those X's and you go, what the heck is he doing? When I actually write something like this, the whole idea is, I'm putting this in a script so I don't have to remember this, I don't have to retype this again. So I go, PS, whatever my switches are, pipe, head, enter. I now have a line, and I just replace all the columns that I don't care about with X. I am in effect throwing away all of those columns in the read command. Any of the columns that I actually want to use in the body of my loop, I just give them a name. Whatever name is convenient. PID, CMD. The nice thing about the read command is that when it has filled in each of the little placeholders, anything that's left over gets assigned to the last variable you listed on its line. So args, which is some variable number of arguments for whatever this process had, is conveniently just stuffed into the args variable in this read command. The whole point of the pipe mill is I use any command piped into a while read loop. Read has the nice ability to parse each of the lines that it reads into variables for us. So you can eliminate something like 90 to 95% of all your uses of cut with just this. And this is just parsing on whatever your IFS is, which is actually more convenient than cut, where you have to figure out, well, now were those separated by tabs or spaces? And also a lot of the uses of awk are being used just to parse lines out into separate arguments, and you don't need to. That's why, if you don't learn anything else from what I'm talking about today, the pipe mill is the one thing you want to take home with you. Because I use this all the time just sitting there at a command line. In the do loop, I can have as many different things in here as I want. So if, for instance, I want to kill any process that's owned by a given user that has a parent ID matching this and a TTY attached to it like that, then I replace a couple of those X's with PPID and, you know, user and TTY, which is the one just before CMD. That one I do remember. And I do that, and then I can have additional tests in here and say, if this is that, and, you know, dash A, this equals that, then kill it. or kill its parent, for example. So for instance, when I have to kill zombies, you know you can't actually kill zombies. So this is a way I search for the parents and kill the parents of the zombies. Go ahead.
Is the pipe after done, I can't quite see it, is that of any significance?
It's a brace.
Okay, in the second example, I'm giving a simpler example that's more terse. In here, I'm just reading a single variable. Now, the first...
No, he missed it. You misunderstood.
No,
You can't see that that's a brace.
What was brace?
The curly brace.
This is a closed brace, I understand. I'm saying the second example here is
He thought that
just the
was a
same
pipe.
thing all over again.
He thought it was a pipe.
Yeah, this is a
I can't
closed
quite
brace.
see it here.
And I'm getting into why I have that there. This is the same thing, except that first of all, I'm throwing away the header line. Oh, before we go any further, the advantage of this is that you don't have to worry about finding your grep process, because the $CMD on the grep process is going to be grep. The $args will contain a copy of foo. So this is actually already more specific, even though it's a little bit more verbose. Okay, now this other example, the one technical glitch with that one, or one of them, is that it's actually reading the header line for the PS command. Now, since it's not going to match foo anyway, I don't care. But if you really want to be more specific, more precise, then you read X, you read the first line and throw it away, then you go into your while loop. When you do this, you must enclose the whole set of commands in braces. You didn't have to do that with the original while loop, because while implicitly, all the way until the done, all of that has to be in one process. But here I have to force it. So, do this, then I read this. Now what I'm doing is I'm just successively resetting my positional arguments every time to whatever the X was. This reparses the line for me, so now I can just use $13 and $3 if I've actually counted them. Yes?
Okay, I hope I don't sound like an idiot. I usually, okay, what are you doing to throw away the header crap at the top, or does this...
The read X assigns it to X once, and then immediately after that, I'm starting my while read loop, so that reads the next line. I've implicitly thrown away the first line.
Oh, okay.
Didn't have to do anything else special. And you know, you don't have to just use the PS command for this. There are a bazillion commands that give you nice tabular output, line records, space or tab columns that you can use with this sort of thing. Yes?
I have a caution and a question. The caution is if you're on an operating system such as Mac OS X, CMT might very well have blanks in it.
And unfortunately, all you're going to get is the fraction of the CMD. He pointed out that sometimes, and you could do this on Linux, sometimes if your command actually has a space in it, like Mac OS X apparently likes to do, then your CMD variable is, the way it's being parsed here, you're only going to get the first word of it. And there really is no tractable solution to that problem in the PS output. I mean, it's just a limitation that the PS output isn't quoting that column, so you have no way of doing it either.
It's a shame it doesn't have a -0 option.
It would be nice if more things had a -0 or a null terminate each. In this case, it would be really ugly, though, because you'd be null terminating each column.
It wouldn't be for looking at, it would be for pipes.
Well, I understand. And I have for a long time wished that Bash would add a read -0 so that you can force it to read a null terminated value out of its input. But unfortunately, they don't have that yet. And I have tried various tricks to make that work with the existing character separator and IFS and other things like that. They've all been abysmal failures, so sorry, you can't do that. Or if you can, you have to be more clever than I am.
Now, why is it that in this instance, after doing a set to set your line arguments, you don't need a $brace 1.3?
$brace?
Why isn't that dollar the first?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm an idiot. That is a bug. This is an untested piece of code. You are absolutely correct. I was wrong. Give that man a prize.
Slice of pizza.
That's not much of a prize, but
I had a question about braces. I'm familiar with using parens to cause a subshell.
This isn't a
Are the
subshell.
braces,
parens create a subshell. Braces merely group a set of commands to force them to be within one subshell.
was that an ancient born shell or is that something more recent?
That goes pretty far back.
'Cause I don't remember.
Everything that knows how to do shell-defined functions, user-defined functions in the shell.
But that doesn't
Huh?
go as far back as
Are
we
you
do.
sure that's
The
in
very-
Vern?
Functions
It
don't
works
go
in
back
Ash.
where we
Yeah,
go.
born shell didn't have functions.
Yeah, I know, I understand. The very early
Well,
born
Ash
shell did
also
not.
put your current directory in your prompt.
Stop saying very early, we are not that old.
I hate to tell you this, but yes, we are.
Mid-80s.
Well, of course we're that old, but Unix is newer than we are.
Okay.
Unix is even older.
So,
Linux.
there are some minor advantages. That's all built-ins, but who cares in today's world?
Depends on how many times you're doing it.
Even there, but it only matches on the CMD, not on the arguments. Now you're not using a regex. If you wanted to use a glob, you could replace the test command with a case, a single line case, case $13 in, and then you get to use a glob instead. Or you could just pipe $13 through grep-q and use its exit value. Then you're using an external again. And by the way, in that particular example, you're using a copy of grep for every line that you read, so that gets a little silly. Actually, in newer versions of Bourne Shell and Corn Shell, you can actually use regular expressions in a type of brace expansion. So there's dollar, brace, the variable, // and then something. So basically it can have a regular expression that you try and substitute for something else. If that succeeds,
It's a glob.
then, huh?
I think it's a glob.
No, that one is specifically, they show it as a regex. And that's under the category parameter substitution. All right. Maybe they didn't put it in.
Look for a hash or %%.
Yeah, I can tell somebody's been spending way too much time in this particular thing here. So those are your substrings. There you
My
go.
favorite section.
Oh, you're right. That's actually as in path name, so it's a glob. I could have swore they said that was a regex. Okay. Luckily, I don't use that very often, because if I have to do that, I usually do actually use the external grep.
Well, I use that instead of using base name to get the base name of $0.
Yes. Yes. I use those a lot for dir name and base name, using the hash and the percent sign.
Well, when I actually don't care what the base name is, and I know I'm just swapping out the extension.
Yes. Okay. So, the essential pattern of the pipe mill, which is the most useful one, I use that pattern probably more than any other single shell scripting thing. So, that's why I spend a little extra time on it. You can also parse, if you find a command that has multi-lines of output, you can actually do something like while read line 1, semicolon, read arg1, arg2, arg3 as an example. So you'd be parsing on every other line in that example. Because your while actually can take a whole list of separate commands before the do. So even if you have multi-line output, as long as it's very regular, you can still do it. It gets really ugly if you're trying to use this to parse the ifconfig command, because ifconfig generates different numbers of lines of output depending on whether or not that particular interface already has an address assigned to it. and whether or not it's an Ethernet interface or some other weird kind of interface, and the simple answer is don't go there. I've had to write scripts that parse out ifconfig output. They're ugly, and they have all kinds of nasty special cases in them. Another limitation, by the way, of the pipe mill is you can't use a command like VI in there, because your standard input is already clobbered. So this will cause you problems. I've even tried explicitly redirecting my input back from my terminal with the VI. That doesn't work either, I've found out. However, you can use for loops for that. And for loops I use almost as much as I use while loops. I was going to give you a ifconfig example, by the way. And then I was refreshing my memory about how ugly the ifconfig command output was. Oops. Okay, so let's go back up to our preview. We talked about the set command and the things we can do with that. Now I don't have the example. I didn't find that old backup script that I had. The one about spawning off a whole bunch of child processes, then doing a wait. Feeding your shell. Here's an example. Had a problem where I needed to change all of the files that were owned by a given user to his new user ID. But I wanted to preserve the permissions that were on all of them. When you use the chown command, it strips off any SUID or SGID bits that it finds. Right? So, I want to somehow preserve those while I'm wading through them, and I want to do it in a single command if I can. You ready for something that's kind of sick? Let's see, is it .owner or user? I think it's -user. $foo. I'm just going to give this an example. Here's the, oh, now I don't like to go over -proc, but I will in this case. Let's assume he has no processes running right now. But here's the trick.
You need help.
So, when I'm talking about feeding your shell, one of the things you can do is you can use one command to generate a bunch of shell commands. And then you can use that to feed them directly into a copy of sh-, which will then gleefully execute all of them. In this particular case, I'm using the printf, which has the nice side effect of anything that's not a %sign thingy, the replaceable parameter, in finds printf, it will just replicate on every line of output as just straight static text. And we know who the user is, and at the time that find is looking at it, %sign p, which is the path, it knows. And the mode, well, we haven't actually executed the chmod yet, so the mode is before the chmod. It's captured conveniently in a numeric format that chmod can use. Now, I will be honest, usually when I do this, I actually pipe it through less first. Sometimes I just redirect it to a temp file and actually look at it and then run shell on that. Sometimes I'm a coward. However, I'll give you another example. This I use a lot, especially in my Kickstart scripts. So I'll do wget -O-, you know, http:// kickstart $, my company pipe sh-. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the rest of the URL, but I'm sure you understood that, you know. /post install.sh. Right. So the trick is that in most of my Kickstart environments, my post consists of just that one line. I'm fetching the shell script off of the server and letting it do all of its work. Now obviously I would prefer to do that with an HTTPS in most environments, but usually my Kickstart environment, if somebody has hacked my Kickstart, become a man in the middle between me and my Kickstart server, I'm dead already. Because various things like my PXE boot and my TFTP of my kernel were already unencrypted. So if he already got in between us, then he already owns my machine. So I'm not too worried about that particular case. I'll show you another example of something that I do. Sometimes on the command line I use backticks for my own personal typing convenience, but when I'm teaching I like to do it this way. This is a Linux specific trick. So in my post installs, a lot of times I do this trick right here, because when I started the Kickstart, for instance over a PXE server or whatever, then I can just add my own parameter. H equals some host name. X equals some extra post-install package that I expect on this machine. M equals a machine type. I can give it anything I want. When you start up Linux, it has this command line that was passed to it by the bootloader. And every Linux bootloader out there lets you add your own additional parameters. And any parameters that Linux doesn't know about itself, Linux does two things with them. If it's of the form this equals that, where this is any valid variable pattern, then it puts that in the inits environment before it spawns init. Now I can't actually use that in, for instance, a post install, because by the time Anaconda is running the post install, the environment has been scrubbed at some point or another. I don't know when, I just know it has been. The other thing is that any of the parameters that were not of the form foo equals bar are added to the init command line, which it then passes on to its first RC script. So you can actually find those during your boot process. But again, that's not useful for me in a post install. So I just do this, and then I run a little case, a while, or either a for I or a while loop on my command line arguments, and a case, and I look for the arguments that I set. And then I invoke additional post installs, so that big post install that I described before, it actually does this, and then it calls additional, fetches and calls additional post installs based on arguments that it finds.
Sweet.
So, kind of cool if you want to do things where you want to set the host name on the machine before, in the post install, but you don't want to have to wait until afterwards and log into it and do a bunch of fuzzy stuff. So, another nice thing is, how many people here ever do Kickstarts and use PXE Linux CFG files? Not very many, a few. Okay. One of the nice things is you can actually just supply those if you DHCP assign a fixed IP address to a given host based on its MAC address. Then when you create one of those little PXE Linux files, you can actually just assign the extra arguments on the end of its command line. So it's pretty easy to write a script that fills in a template and fills all those in. So, kind of a neat trick. Okay, now, one of the most common things that I see people fighting with in shell scripting is what to do about temporary variables, or temporary files. How to clean up after them, how to safely make them. So, let me throw it out to you. What's the safest way you know of to make a temp variable inside your shell script? Well, now, $$ is really easy to predict, and it's a fairly small number, so it's going to have lots of collisions.
A temp file, you say?
Yes, you want to safely create a temp file.
Create a directory, and if you're successful, create a file name.
Exactly. So, the best way I've ever found to do that is make dir /temp / now here you can use $. Personally, I like to do something like $0, well, actually, base name, $0, dot, date per, plus, %s, dot, $. Something like that. Usually I actually like to exit with an error message. Echo some error to exit, etc.
Isn't there a new function that will synthesize a guaranteed unique file name?
There is a make temp or make temps command that has historically been somewhat unreliable and easy to guess for race conditions and things like that, so it hasn't been a very good way to do that. This thing here, the nice thing is that the make dir resolves to one system call that is atomic. So after it's parsed its line, it's either going to all succeed or all fail. And then after you do that, and by the way, before you do this, what you actually do is you assign this value to a variable, and then you do make dir $temp. Or fail, and then you just use $temp as a base directory for all your other temp files. And usually you do a chmod 0700 of your temporary directory right afterwards. Yes?
So I've got a function to make a temporary directory.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does is it just starts out as very something simple, but it's in a loop. And each time it fails, it adds $random.
Yes.
$random to the end. And it usually doesn't go too many iterations before it succeeds.
Yes, yes. It depends on how persistent you want to be and how likely you are to have a collision. Right. I have found that $0, dates per s, $, has, I mean, if somebody's really actively trying to get you, then you might find a collision there, but otherwise you're not likely to.
Well, it's not.
But I agree that you can go into a loop, and I've done that.
It's just to guarantee that you successfully create a directory at some point.
Yes. I have often, what I usually use is just the sequence command in a while loop. The seq command, by the way, is one of the more useful ones. I showed you an example of it earlier. And I have had to, on a number of occasions, write my own version, my own mini version of the sequence command for various operating systems that don't include it. But if I have any say in the matter, what I usually do is tell whoever owns that box to go download a copy of the GNU utilities and install them on that so we have it. Because SEQ, it takes up to 3 arguments. So if you just give it one argument, it counts from 1 to whatever that is. If you give it 2, it counts from the first one to the second one. If you give it 3, it counts from the first one by steps of the second one up to the third one, which I hate because I always get that wrong. If I hadn't just messed that up yesterday, I would have not remembered it to tell you.
You were never a Fortran program.
Actually, you're right, I wasn't.
Actually, what makes it confusing is there are some things where when you're doing increment, it goes from first number to second number, step of the third number. And
yes.
They swap those two. That's what's got used.
That's what confuses me because things like Python has a range and an X-range command. It does that. And every other programming language I've seen that has a little range thingy that can do it by steps has used the increment as the third argument. So, yeah, it gets me every time. Another thing I wanted to mention about this is, you may have noticed I put a semicolon before this closed brace. In current versions of Bash, that is required. It will not work if you don't do that.
The brace has to be on a separate line.
Or it has to be on a separate line, one or the other. And the reason is this. Earlier versions of Bash that did not require the semicolon before the brace, or have it on a separate line, created an ambiguity with that. Because the braces are technically not command separators. They're not tokens of the same class as a semicolon, a pipe, a double ampersand, or a parentheses. If I do this with a parentheses, then we should get an error message. So between bash like 203 and 204, they fixed that. Well, when they fixed that, there were about 5 million shell scripts out there, a few of them mine, that had been using the sloppy way of doing it forever because it worked. So that's one of those rare things where bash has done something that will cause you heartache.
Jim?
Yes?
I just wanted to say one more thing about makedir. It's useful if you ever want to limit a script to one invocation at a time. You can have a lock directory, and you can have it try to create that lock directory. And of course, you want to make sure that whenever you error out of that script, you remove the directory, and at the successful end of the script, you remove the directory. And if you can't create it, then you can't get a lock. But because it's atomic, only one process will ever be successful in creating it if it doesn't exist.
Right. So what he's talking about here is trying to create a mutex using a directory or a file within that subdirectory as a lock. The tough part about this, and I wish I had access to the machine here. I wonder if I can, well,
If you can make this work with a projector, it's on the net. It's got SSH.
yeah, I don't want to create quite that much disruption. All right. So what I was going to show you is, a little while ago I had a developer ask me, what's a lock file? When I explained to him that the problem with his Perl script was that it was, what's a stale lock file? Because his script was not detecting stale lock files, and other people who administered this subsystem told me definitively that there was no file locking anywhere in the system, and that it was a problem in the, because that was all handled by the database. And then when I did an strace, I found that no, there was a lock file, and that's why the process wasn't starting up. And so I spent an hour to write the simplest shell script that I could that seemed to have no races in using a mutex lock, a file as a mutex lock. Because the trick is, if I fail to acquire the lock, well, that's the easy part. What I end up having to do is look for a PID file under there, do a kill-0 on the PID file, find out if there is still a living process by that number. Okay, that's easy enough. If there isn't, I have to remove the stale lock file. Then I have to attempt to acquire the lock again. Well, I have to keep in mind that there might be another process right now trying to kill that very same lock file and grab the new lock. And it took me about an hour and a half and 25 lines of code to come up with something that I couldn't detect any races in. I still wouldn't guarantee you there are no races in it. I will guarantee you it's not NFS safe. On a local file system, however, it seems to be, because the test methodology, and part of my hour and a half was developing a test methodology that would start up as many processes as I could, all sleeping for very short periods of time and trying to do it all at the same time, and then cross-checking one another to see if somebody, if two processes managed to get the lock. So, trying to do lock file handling with stale lock file detection and removal is tricky. I did get it, and unfortunately I don't have it on this machine. It's on one of my machines at home or possibly at work. All right, I did post it to my boss who was asking about this. So, I'm sorry I don't have that one, but we should come up with a way for me to post it to somewhere to our website or something. Because I'll actually be curious if anybody can actually find a bug in it, a race condition on a local file system. Huh? I might even offer a prize for it. So there's another trick that a lot of people don't realize that you can do. Oops, better put quotes around that. instead of making temp files, a lot of times you can actually use shell variables as little temp files. As long as the stuff is small enough, if I do things like this.
Does defout still exist?
I'm sorry?
Does it still exist?
Does what still exist?
Defout?
DFI? I just made that up. It still exists, I promise. So that's my current DF output. And I could use things like this.
Why did you need quotes around the echo argument?
It all is one line otherwise.
Yes,
Because why?
because the IFS and parsing handling would turn it all into one big line.
Okay, I'll go first.
So the trick is, if you're going to use a shell variable as a mini temp file, then you have to quote every use of it that you're going to use with anything else in the world. That's the ugly trick. But you can grep this, you can pipe it through sed, use it in backticks, and do all kinds of interesting things with it. Years ago, I wrote a little script which I called the Space Low Early Warning System. And it used no temp files at all, because, well, if you're really that low on space, then any temp files I create might fail. And I wanted to make sure that I wasn't leaving any files laying around and having to clean up after them, no matter how I died, no matter how I was killed. I didn't want to leave any trace that I had been there. So I used all these with, capturing into the shell variables, grepping through them, parsing them, and then repeating parts of them in here documents that were being sent into mail that were, of course, piping straight into sendmail-t. Which, by the way, that's another example, another shell scripting tip for you. I have seen more people fussing over bad ways to send mail from a script than I care to count. The only safe way I know of to send mail in a script is to pipe it. So usually I'll do something where I'll have a group of commands and I'll say something like, cat, foo, to jimd@ starshine.org, subject, testing 1, 2, 3, df out, for example. I'm going to actually put that in there so it doesn't end up all in one line. Now here's the interesting part. Pipe. Depends on where yours is. A lot of systems these days put it in libexec. I'm not even sure, it might even be on my path, so I'll just say sendmail-t. Now you might have to actually fill in your path or make sure it's on your path. I'm sure you all realize that. The -t says take your header from your input. So what you see is that there has been no opportunity for a shell command line to reparse some shell variable and allow a hacker to do weird backticky type stuff to confuse this thing. As far as I know, the variable expansion inside my here doc is safe. So that's the only safe way I know of to send mail from a shell script. Now there's another shell scripting hint for you here that's worth noting. I hate it when I look at a shell script and I see echo blah 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 blah, echo blah 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 blah, echo blah 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 blah, and a whole page full of echoes. Use a here doc, please. Right? It allows me much cleaner formatting, and I, as the reader or maintainer of this thing, can read it and understand what it's doing right away. And mentally, I don't have to parse out a whole lot of echoes.
Jim,
Yeah.
can you give me an example of how somebody would take advantage of not sending email that way?
Well, typically people have done various things like user UCB mail or send mail, and it's I forget the arguments even, but -f is from, and there's a thing that says who to send it to, and a -s for subject. And I have seen exploits. Unfortunately, I cannot concoct them. I can never get them right. But I've seen exploits where people put things like $parent something or another closed parent, like $parent, open up this other file and FTP it to somewhere else, all redirected to dev no closed parent, all in there. That has to be executed by a shell. The sendmail copy has to be executed by a shell, and all of its arguments are going to be expanded. And anything that was in double quotes is going to be susceptible to any $parent or backtick magic that somebody was doing inside there. That's the problem. And there have been a whole lot of exploits that involved bad parsing. So that's why what you want to do is feed it into sendmail through its standard input. And you want to do that as a general pattern wherever possible. Don't put, any unvetted dollar expansions in double quotes on any command line. That's kind of the tainting concept. Now, if you can pipe the mess through TR and do a -D of all the $signs and all the backticks, then you might be able to be safe. But knowing exactly the whole list of things you have to clean out of that and what it's going to do to munch your line gets very ugly.
Can I just suggest what I think is a sample exploit? So I think you have to use backticks. I think $parent actually protects you, but and I might be wrong about that. But you can imagine there's a variable in a configuration file $from, and maybe you even accept this from the CGI script. We're running CGI back, and so the user can override from and set it to user at host backtick semicolon some shell command he wants to run.
Yes. Yeah, I have seen exploits of that sort. I don't have any of them handy, and I don't try to concoct them on my own. Because every time I try to, then it doesn't work, and I get frustrated, and I spend hours going, wait a second, I'm supposed to have a different backtick somewhere else. I won't pretend to be the leaked cracker from hell. But I do remember certain patterns that I have seen over and over again on BugTrack, which does help. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and Control-C that. Let me think here. What else did I want to cover? Oh, the other one is a couple of tricks with the trap command. How many people here have ever used trap? A few. When we're talking about, for instance, creating a temp directory and possibly populating it with a bunch of files, usually right before you do that, what you want to do is a trap rm-fr $temp on exit. Now, exit is not a normal signal, but at least Bash, and I think Corn Shell and a number of other shells, have the ability to treat a certain, actually there are 3 of them, 3 different conditions, as though they were signals. So if you trap on exit, that means any type of exit to the shell, whether it was generated by any catchable error, no, -kill doesn't count, any catchable error or any normal exit command anywhere in the script, and it will run whatever is associated with the exit trap. So you register your rm-fr with something like this. And you can do this in an interactive shell, by the way. So I can say rm-fr/temp. I'll just give $$ for simplicity's sake. Exit. If I do a trap-p, you see that I have indeed done this. By the way, you usually want to put your trap function or command list in single quotes. A lot of times, if you have a variable reference inside there, you want it to be expanded at the time that the trap is executed, not at the time that you set the trap. Now, for $, it doesn't matter, because that's not going to change for the life of your process. But for various other things, you might have set your variable to different values throughout the course of execution. Now, the 2 other special traps that I'm particularly fond of are error and debug. So if you do a trap on debug, then that is a command that will be executed before each normal command in the rest of the script. So instead of set -x, you can actually customize it and, like, for instance, check the value of some variable. So after each command, you can check to see if something else somehow munged your variable. And error is something that will automatically be executed if any command or pipeline returns an error. So those are kind of handy. In fact, I've got a little example that just does a couple of them. There's also in Bash a magic variable named $line_no. That's your line number. Now, I'm going to uncomment this one right here, because capital Z is not, it's one of the only characters that's not a valid flag or switch to the ls command. And we see that my debug line is being executed for everything after the second line, so line 3, 6, 7. Obviously the blank lines aren't being executed, so it doesn't count those. And then we see here that it printed an error at, oh, and I told it to exit with 127 in that case, but we're exiting with an error here, and the last line it executed was 12. Wasn't supposed to get, oh, right, I took the exit out of here. Okay, so it just ran the trap, but it didn't exit the whole script. The reason it didn't is earlier I was also using the set-e. Set-e says any simple command in my script returns an error, give up. Exit at that point. So if you don't want to have to do an explicit error check after every command in your script, but you still want it to die if it gets to any point where it failed, you can use this. Now, I personally never use that in a production script. I might use it occasionally when I'm debugging one, but normally I catch every possible error that I can think of. A typical script of mine starts out at about 10 lines long. That's before any error checking. It then grows to about 200 lines. That's every error I can think of, every possible way I can think of to try and recover from that error and still keep going in some sane fashion. And then I use logger. Usually, in my scripts, I check to see if there is an available logger command. So I use which logger. And if I want it to both log the message to the syslogs, this is especially useful for cron jobs, or for anything that might be spawned by any kind of daemon where there's not a human there to see it, or things that I dispatch through, batch SSH commands. I typically have a syslog that's going to consolidate my logs to some other place so I can scan for all the ones that had errors. The -s on logger also copies the error message to standard error of the current process as well. So it copies it out to the syslog and to the standard error. So I use it a lot. So if I do this, save it, and run it again, then that's where it exits right after the -z, and it doesn't go on to the echo 5. I can also, by the way, combine the two. It explicitly tells you that if you have an error trap set, it will run that first, then it will do the exit on the -e. So that's kind of handy too. So let me throw it open. Does anybody have any other kinds of questions or shell scripting problems that you want to bring up?
Explain how the brackets around the leading F in the foo example from an hour ago cause it not to be picked up with grep.
Oh, okay. So the regex foo will match FOO. It won't match anything else. A regex square bracket F close square bracket followed by something else will match foo, but it will not match an F followed by a literal square bracket. It'll only match F followed by an O. So by putting the square brackets around that character, I match the thing I wanted to without matching my own grep command, because the grep literally has square bracket F close square bracket in its argument list.
That's devious.
It's a trick I saw on Usenet like 10 years ago, and I just remembered. And I've used it. You know, unfortunately, it's useless if the thingy that you're trying to grep on is a variable.
Were you sure that show me what the grep prints? Because I didn't remember that it puts a bracket around.
Okay, I can do that.
That would make it sink in.
Let's see, how am I going to do this? PS pipe grep.
Okay.
I almost always put my regular expressions and globs that I want to pass to a command rather than have the shell expand them, almost always quote those. So when I'm using find dash name, I pretty much always put quotes around those, especially in a script where you don't know if something will actually expand into that right there on the find line. I'll give you an example of that in a second, but let's just do this. Right, I don't have any...
I'll try PS.
Oh, okay, sure.
Poop.
Poop, yes.
Okay,
So-
now without it, what do you think? That's what I wanted.
The grep process as well.
You might
Okay,
have
no,
to-
I understand what he's saying. That's...
might have to run it a few times.
Now this time,
Okay, well, find a process that is running.
How about init?
Yeah,
bash.
yes.
How about PS pipe?
You might find a few of those.
How about just anything SH?
Okay.
Oh, you know what the problem is?
You-
I haven't been passing any parameters to my like AUX. Okay, so that's going to find all of the instances of SH
Right.
without finding any greps.
But show me what it looks like when it finds a grep. That's what
Now
I...
you better go back to the
Right.
PS thing, because it's shorter output.
How about grep?
Well, that wasn't very interesting, was it?
Well,
Yeah, we
it's just
got
showing
this.
that
Oh, now I
grep,
understand.
the
No,
actual literal argument
It's
is...
clear now. Okay,
Right.
thanks.
It's a weird trick, and I almost never use it. I wouldn't use it in a script, because in a script, I really care which column it's in, whether it's really in the command column or whether it's really in the arguments.
What if you just want to find if the process is running?
The actual even better answer on a typical Linux box today is you can just use pkill.
I don't keep, doesn't.
It actually does a patterned kill.
Well, what if I don't want to kill it? I just want to know if it's running.
Well, I'm pretty sure you can use pkill-0, so pkill...
pgrep works.
There's a pgrep too, that figures.
Run man pkill again, actually. First line.
Man,
Man pkill.
kill, and it says, yeah, there are a bunch of them. This is something that's newer, and so I pretty much never remember to use it. I never put it in a script because I never know whether it's going to be available on the machine that's running the script or not. But if I want to know if a process is running, I still want to only match against the command name of it.
Right.
I don't want to accidentally catch it if it happens to be an argument of some other miscellaneous process running around.
Oh, I see what you mean by a script.
Yeah. And whenever possible, I prefer to actually have commands where they have actually created a PID file, and I'll go use the PID file and kill -0 on cat backtick whatever PID, if they've documented that they're going to use the PID file at all. Because that's more precise. I've always been a little wary about matching the process table for commands when any old fool might just create some process and name it any old thing they want. Right? Sort of like I'm always wary of any kind of regex or glob pattern. I'm always thinking, okay, what corner case did I miss? You know, whenever I'm writing Perl or awk or shell, I'm always thinking, what pattern is going to match this that I didn't want, and how much damage am I going to do when I do an inadvertent match?
How about looking for your program that you're working on and catching the Vim session?
haven't done that, but that would hurt. Yes?
Just to be pretty clear about what that bracket notation was doing in case.
Well, I got that.
You got it? Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean,
it's
I'm
the
just
equivalent
matching
of
a
ref-dash.
character class of only one character, but I'm using the side effect that the way it anchors them together doesn't work with the square brackets around it.
Right.
So.
Without that.
If I put a question mark
ref-dash
after the
V.
square bracket, then I break it again, by the way.
Yes.
So. Yes?
Over the weekend, I ran into a problem with a bunch of file names with quotes and spaces in them. And I needed to find pipe to XRs to some command.
Uh-huh.
This is on a Solaris box that doesn't have the minus print 0 flag on find.
And it doesn't have a -0 flag on your XArgs either.
Right. So,
Answer, get GNU utilities and install them on the Solaris box. No.
I actually piped it through a send command that just put quotes around the whole thing.
Yeah.
And parsed and basically added a slash for additional quotes, and that took care of the spaces in the quote problem. But it seemed to work. But I was wondering if there's a more elegant solution instead of just installing all the GNU tools.
Yes. The answer is, okay, the question was, he said that he had a particular case where he ended up having to add quotes and backslash quotes into the output of one command, like a printf perhaps.
Find.
The printf on a find.
Yeah.
Yeah, the printf on a find. He had to add a bunch of extra verbiage to get the other end of the pipeline to parse it correctly. The fact is that in shell scripting, about 80-ish% of the work is understanding all the different types of expansion and parsing that are going on. How each variable and brace and everything is going to get expanded into a longer, or possibly null list of these things. And then how to get around how it's going to interpret that. And how it's going to split them into separate arguments sometimes when you don't want them to. So the difference between double quotes, single quotes, and not having any quotes around it at all is vastly important in the shell. And it's like, you know, if you actually, there was in the Learning the Bash shell, there was a great little list they had of, it was I think 14 separate steps of different types of expansion. Alias expansion, history expansion, brace expansion, variable expansion, glob expansion, right? And how they interacted with quoting. And once you managed to figure out what that final command line was before it was interpreted, then the rest is basically some plumbing and a bunch of exec. And by plumbing, I mean opening up file descriptors for any of your greater than, less than, and pipe signs, and creating sub-processes and attaching them with pipes. Things like that. That's the plumbing, and then the last bit of it is the exec.
In that grep example we had that you said, well, a question mark would break it. Are you sure you meant a question mark and not a period? Question mark.
I am sure that's what I meant. I'll give you the example. So what that should do is make this character here optional. Not matter if it's there or not.
Is that an extended regular?
I thought that would just expand to a single character.
That's file globs.
Huh?
It's a file glob, isn't it?
No.
No. In regular expressions, the dot is any character.
Okay.
The question
That's 0 or
is
0,
0 or 1.
Right.
I could also try a star there. I think I'm not going to find one anyway here, and I'm not sure.
Well, the dot would have.
That would be 0 or more.
That's 0 or more.
That's
I think
multiple
if you did
Gs,
the
right?
egrep, it would do the question mark.
Oh, is that what they did?
I think it's an extended, part of the extended, no, I mean the command, the actual command.
I'm sorry, that's what I meant.
Or grep.
I've obviously been standing up here too long. There you go. You're right.
Whoa, grep this. Grep is dumber than egrep.
Yeah.
fgrep is even dumber, and actually I like that. That's a feature of fgrep. But
actually being told.
Remember I said there's a threshold below which I don't let the trivia actually get indexed? That's it right there.
I had an interview question where I was supposed to use shell only to do a histogram of words in a file, and the crux of it was that I had to understand a particular option of a particular command, and I didn't say anything at the time, but that when I realized that was the solution, you know, because he said, oh, well, you need this particular option. I didn't say it, but it really pissed me off because, you know,
Well, that's a trivia. I mean, you know, I'm told that a lot of my interview questions are hard, but I try not to actually base them on trivia. Right? What I really care more about when I'm asking interview questions, even really tough ones, like how many steps between the power on self-test and a login prompt can you name that might be of any value in debugging? I don't care if you get all 12 of them that I can think of. What I care about is, will you at least try?
Mm-hmm.
Will you think about things like, okay, well, I know that there's got to be a bootloader, and I know there's going to be a kernel, and, well, gosh darn it, the bootloader's got to come before the kernel. And, gee, I have experience, so I've seen things like Lilo and Grub, and I think those are bootloaders. That's what I care about. I kind of grade on a curve. You know, if you can get, like, 8 of them, you're doing pretty well. If you mention initRD and LinuxRC, you're ace. You're probably getting my recommendation, because it's really hard to find sysadmins that know that. Right? That question came up on the Sage members mailing list again, and somebody responded in a way that I thought was rather unpleasant to me. He said, oh, you're just looking like for somebody who's just like you with those questions. I never in my 20 years of blah, 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 needed to know that. It's like, well, it's nice that you didn't need to know that, but the original poster said he was looking for people who are, quote, up to snuff on Linux. Right? Hands-on techie stuff, not like administrative managerial stuff or whatever. Okay? And no, that's not looking for a clone of me, because, like, if it was a clone of me I was looking for, then I'd be asking, okay, what are some of the worst gotchas you've ever faced when creating spec files for RPMs, and what do you do in a RPM post-install script to tell the RPM to abort the installation, or pre-install script, or whatever. That sort of thing, because those are the things that I have to fight with now myself, actually. Anyway, any other things? I don't know how long we've gone.
A little while.
Hour and a half? Okay.
When you mentioned printing screen information before a shell script, and you mentioned all the echoes, echo, line by line, you mentioned another way to do that, and I zoned out.
I just said cat with a here document.
Oh.
Alright, so I can just say, you know, cat, foo, or dash foo. This is a fun way to create screenfuls of text. And I can do the same thing.
Where does the minus get you?
The minus says basically ignore leading indentation. So it allows you to indent the whole block and not worry about it.
What about tab?
So tab foo would work.
So you can have a space before the foo.
Yes, you can
Thank
have
you.
spaces before things, and it will ignore those.
That makes things so much tidier.
Yeah, it just strips them.
Yeah, it just strips all the leading space off.
So if you wanted indentation, you lost it.
Exactly, that's why usually I actually don't use it, but when you're already deeply nested in a shell script and you want this to actually be flush left, then you use the dash so that it looks prettier. Also, if you put quotes, any type of quotes around that end marker, what I'm putting up here is foo, then it will treat the entire thing as though it's quoted. And I've noticed that it actually does things, okay, if I say something like $home, and let's say I put in a bunch of spaces and $log name, maybe, and then foo. Okay, so it has expanded those. Now, it did not ignore my leading spaces on that one. Maybe it's only leading tabs.
You get put quotes around
I'm going to do that next. There. So it only ignores leading tabs. My mistake. And now I'm going to put quotes around it. And even though they're double quotes, if I recall correctly, even though they're double quotes, which are normally what we call soft quotes, it treats them as though every $ thingy in there was a hard quote. So it doesn't expand anything inside there. That's kind of a quirk. I usually would not put double quotes around that because I think it's kind of misleading.
If you use single quotes, would it also do the same thing?
It does exactly the same thing.
Instead of dash food, it strips tabs and not spaces, or the other way around?
It does strip tabs, and it did not strip spaces. Which is kind of a corner case that I didn't remember.
That's what you want, right? You're more likely
But
to
it
have
is what I
tabs in your-
want,
in your
yes.
code spaces in the actual text.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're a Python guy, you want to use leading spaces always and do expand tabs, but, you know. All right, any other weird cases or interesting questions? We can open it up a little wider. It doesn't have to be just shell scripting. Or we can break early. So this is the first time that we've had a normal meeting at this campus.
Ready?
Did
First
you
time
show off the Fibonacci script?
Oh man, I haven't seen that thing in years. I taught a weekend shell scripting class, or basic shell script. I think it was actually just basic or intermediate Unix class at Mission College one time. And I wrote a one-line script that was a recursive Fibonacci using the internal, and it was something like, Heather, you really had to put me on the spot, didn't you? Okay, something like echo oops. I'm not going to try that. It was something like, it was uglier than that. But basically, it returned, I ran it in class with like a small number, like 20 or 30, and it sat there churning on my laptop for the rest of the class. Because what it does is it spawns off another copy of the shell for each of its two arguments. Oh, one of them you have to do, that was it. It was $1 minus, what is it? That one? I think it does it that way. I'll have to try it. This is in the category of...
Had it there, we could just say this one.
Hmm?
Do you want just single parentheses?
No. I definitely want double parentheses because I'm doing an arithmetic expansion.
But you need, $0 will be the name of the script, right? So you need
Oh, I need the backticks. That's what I'm...
$$.
On each one of those, that was the other thing that was very ugly about this. Thank you. I think it counts as perhaps one of the ugliest pieces of code I ever wrote, which is why I have blissfully forgotten it until now, almost. So let's see how long that churns.
Oh, you don't have it telling us all about it. Yeah.
It can't until the end. It has to expand all the way out, but it should be done by now. I mean, it's only
Bash on SXV.
I'll do that. I'm sure I have a bug in it. It took me about... Woo! There we go. All right, so we do sh-x.
It's recursing on the first one. You've just done it.
Yes, it is recursing on the first line, which is what it's supposed to do. But I think
you're missing one more quote.
I'm missing.
I think the -1 needs to be in a math thing.
One, huh?
Uh,
I think it has to be
I think you need
-1.
one more level of arithmetic expansion somewhere.
Oh, yes, you're right. You are absolutely correct.
It's part of why it is so very ugly. I think it looks prettier and more elegant in C.
Well, there are better ways to do this, even in Bash. And the actual whole point of that particular class session, which I had debugged before I went to class, but I'd written it up on the board, right? And the point of this was to explain why recursion, simple recursion, is sometimes not the best way to do
You'll probably
things.
want to put setXB inside the script.
Yeah,
Because
otherwise
you're
you're
just
going to see
seeing
first
the-
walk, but
The first one. Yeah.
Shebang.
doesn't matter. At least you know it's a big document.
Well, this ought to entertain people at least. I don't know how full I have made my process table, but I'm sure I'm doing something very bad with it.
How about a smaller argument?
I don't think that's going to matter. See, bang minus 1, bang minus 1. Well, anyway, set dash x v. Oops. That doesn't look expanded to me.
Negative 135.
Huh?
Negative 134.
Oh, there we are.
Base case.
Ah, yes. Okay. Well, I'm not even going to remember how I did that. I remember I did bound it to positive numbers somehow, and I'll have to think about exactly where I did
Send
it.
it to the list.
Huh?
Send it to the list.
Now we got two things I got to send to the list. All right. Any others? Where are we going after this meeting? Yes.
So, at what point do you say this script is too complicated for Bash? Let's do it differently.
All right. That's a very good question. That's an excellent question. Give that man a T-shirt. So, the point at which I say, let's go to Perl or awk or Python or something, is actually pretty early. As soon as I see anything that looks like it will be solved by an associative array, hash, dictionary, or a data structure more complex than a string, a simple string, or possibly a simple integer, as soon as it gets beyond those limits, then yes, go to a different scripting language.
How about if you ever have to open an IP for it?
Generally, I will go to a scripting language, even though Shell, like Bash, has support, depending on if you compile it in, it has support for a special namespace /dev TCP host and port number and UDP host and port number. So you can do bizarre netcat-like things directly in Bash if it was compiled with that support. But like, for instance, on a Debian system, they don't turn on that configure option when they build it by default.
You have to mention.
And
that
I wouldn't
often-
ever trust that it's there, so at that point I would use, at least I would pull out netcat. And that's the other side of the answer to his question, which is, if I've got anything in the world that does most of what I want and it needs just a little massaging, then yeah, I'll call that in my shell script. If its output is reasonable, then I'll call it, massage it the way I want, marshal it into something else. That's what shell is for, is executing external commands, taking the results of them and marshaling them and connecting them together for you.
This is a great technical discussion about what is often a political and management issue. Sometimes you don't have a choice, and it doesn't matter whether the right tool is something else. You have to use this because bogus reason number 1, bogus reason number 2, bullshit reason number 3.
I have seen a number of cases where the answer was, we do most of the work in a Perl script, and then we write a little wrapper in shell to say that we wrote it in shell.
Thank you, I never tried that.
That works great with most management. They say, well, it starts with the shebang thing. You told me it was a shell script. It's a shell script. Even if it only consists of like 2 lines.
Exactly.
Now, I have seen counterexamples. Somebody at work showed me a Perl script where practically every line was backtick calling some other command, and they were not checking for any errors out of this, and they weren't like blessing those, you know, or cleaning up those variables that they were passing around all over the place. And the worst part was they were calling backtick Perl blah 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 repeatedly in this thing. They were calling other Perl scripts from within Perl. So
They were promoted soon after.
no, actually, from what I understand, that same person is still maintaining that same build system, and it still has very their usual debugging involves editing the file.
Wow.
Yeah. Because they have placed no error checking or debugging semantics within its logic, because that would all clutter it up.
That type of code writing is more common than you think it is.
Yes.
This is a question. There's a number of systems that move Perl around. So sometimes it's if someone's installed it on a Solaris system, it's used their local bin. Sometimes it's in like you opt something bin. Usually you can find it with a witch, but how do you put that in a Perl script when it's invoked so that you can have a Perl script that will be cross-platform?
There are a couple of very ugly solutions to that problem. My favorite is you have a script that does which Perl, captures the output of that, then calls it -PIE on your main Perl script to replace the shebang line with the Perl one.
You do it with N.
There was a question actually it was asked on, I think it was Sage members.
Yes, you can use, the
Except you have trouble-
Pythonistas use this.
You have trouble passing arguments to it, and it's a little
The
tricky.
shebang line itself took care of this magically. I didn't understand it at first. I
So,
still understand it now.
I don't know.
I've seen
It's
that
some
one, it's
magic
on Google.
project.
But yeah, you should be
I don't
able
know
to
what it is,
find
but
it.
they use my CPU and it's
What is it in the Perl run man?
See, as long as you can rely
Well,
on N
we'll
being
pull it up and show you, but first do this. So this is the Pythonista way of doing it. Okay?
I think
They
it's
use
because
the env command to find whatever the interpreter is.
I was using it before Python.
Huh?
I was using it before.
Well, I'm just saying that you always see this in Python scripts. You almost never see that in Perl. But you can do, and in the Perl run script, I've seen this, man. Perl run / and I think they do some weird eval in it. So I think it looks like that. Okay, so they do an eval of exact Perl with all that garbage on it.
So pretty.
That's
And I agree with Guy. I have read that several times. I've even used it. I found corner cases where it doesn't seem to work.
Hey, look at the middle of the screen.
Yeah, okay.
My favorite way to do it is to feed the name of the Perl script that you're trying to call to a little shell program that basically does a brute force find.
Yeah, that's another way of doing it. There is, the one thing that I really don't like about this, and this is what, the one corner case I've found that really ticks me off, is if you want the -T for taint checking, you can only specify that either on the shebang line or on the command line. You cannot. There is no variable you can set to enable that. I checked. I spent hours in the Perl, channel on IRC talking to the best Perl people I could find to say, no, there must be one somewhere. I also spent a few hours actually trying to read the source code and gave up on that rather rapidly. So that was the one thing that I found that you just could not do from, like, I couldn't get it to run with this exec Perl thing either. I don't even remember why. The -T.
Well, why couldn't you just invoke the Perl interpreter from a shell script? Assuming it's on the path, you don't have to find it?
Yes. Well, and that's what this is really doing, is it's re-execing itself.
The comment in the back was, I do a find to find Perl, but if it's
A
not...
witch, actually.
No, he said find.
He's just
I
searching
didn't
for Perl.
find because,
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
because
It might not be on your
the
path.
works depends on your search environment variable, and if that hasn't been set correctly, Wix won't find it.
Mm-hmm.
But why, can't you assume it's on the path?
Nah.
It's not much
No,
use
I
if
don't
it
assume
isn't.
that it's on the path. If I didn't build the machine, I don't assume.
I think nowadays you more or less can, but go back 5 years and it could have been anywhere depending what.
Well, this assumes it's on the path.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those, I think.
Yes, both of those assume that it is on the path. So I wrote once a script that did something like, you know, Perl
Capital N.
equals backtick which
I have
Perl,
no idea what it's currently working
and then dollar
It's a-
Perl dash pi dash e
on. Some DNA related to that.
This is a general grid service that does random
Just
ones.
sign up for that.
So, does all of them.
It was something like this, except that it also only did it on the first line of the file to...
Doesn't your example here point out something that probably should have been mentioned earlier, the difference in output from the backtick and the dollar parenthesis?
Hold on.
I like
Something like that.
that's 6 power.
I could actually just double quote the whole bloody thing. But everybody know what the dash pi dash e does in Perl?
Yeah.
The dash
Editing
p puts an implicit loop around your expression that says basically be, I think it's be said like, which means read every line of the file, try the expression against it, and then print anything that I didn't do anything else with. So unless I do an explicit next, it will print every line unmodified unless it matches this S expression. Or it will modify it and then print it afterwards. And the I says do an in-place edit. So it is just as though you filtered it through a temp file, then renamed the temp file back over the original file.
E means execute.
The E means an expression to execute. The dash P says execute this expression for every line of the file, and if I don't do anything else with that line, then print it. It becomes part of the output. And the I is an in-place edit. Alright, so this, and the reason I happen to know these as well as I do is because I use them a lot in, for instance, post installs. Both in like RPMs and also in kickstarts. You've got a whole bunch of config files and you need to change them without looking at them. Then you do a lot of these. And sometimes you do the first, like on this one, if I know that the first line is that, then I might do something like this, where, and I don't actually need the parens on that either. That I don't do as often, so I don't remember it exactly, but if I do that on a, here, of course it's going to give me a problem. So first let me create a test file. Thanks. No, I need a lot more punctuation, actually. And here, what I really should do is say, begins with shebang, and this is wrong. And I'm going to, excuse me, clean up this mess here.
Why do you care what comes after Perl?
This is big.
Could have bugs.
Did you need the dot star after the Perl?
Well, actually, what I should do with that, probably,
Get your own list.
is, and I don't remember, I have to do that and a backtick. So I'm keeping any parameters, any dash TWs or anything after it.
Yeah, but if you left that off, it would do the same thing. It's not gonna, it's only gonna replace the stuff up to the last curl.
Yeah, you're right.
You might want to put well, you might have trouble using your slashes as delimiters.
A slash won't
Oh,
work, you
wait,
can see
but-
it, but.
You'll
No.
need- You need to redo the
That's
scar
fine.
after bang, won't you? You should
Oh, you're right. I will want to use something like this. Just because the $Perl is being expanded into something with slashes before the command
But it
executes.
doesn't have shebang, don't you want shebang?
I have a shebang right
It's
there.
right there.
Yeah, but it's gonna replace that.
You're replacing it now.
Oh, thank you.
Close enough.
Now you're replacing it with bang stuff.
Oh,
Are you,
You want the single quotes.
yeah, welcome to coding.
no, what I really wanted, well, I can use the single quotes and then this part like that. I have to change the rest of this.
You want to quote this?
By the way, shell scripting really does look a lot like this most of the time, unfortunately. Do it wrong about 400 times and then get it right. And, oh, I forgot, yep, my slashes, so colon, and,
Yeah, you're gonna, I mean, in real life, you're gonna have to
There
make
we
sure
go.
you're not, you know,
see, I'm breaking it.
The old pattern has been changed.
It has been changed, yes.
Oh, we already tried.
Hmm? No. Oh yeah, okay. Some bad path to Perl. It's probably that exit that's killing me. Come to think of it. Yeah. So what I would then want to do is add one extra little thing. I'd probably just set a variable and say if I've made one change, then skip all the rest. Because I wouldn't actually want to change any other comment lines in there that happen to start with
You
shebang.
could do an and exit, because the replacement will return the number of things replaced, which would be true if you replace something.
Well, yeah, when I just did the exited before it finished the
No, I
processing,
mean,
but no, see, if I exit, I
and-
lose the rest of the script. That's my problem.
Ah.
What I have to do is set a thing, have I done a replacement? And if I haven't done a replacement, as soon as I do that, then I ignore all the rest of the lines
So
of
it
the
makes
file.
scripts less complicated.
Yes.
Well, why didn't you just use an NLE then? Does a while on the...
If I do an N, then I'll have to explicitly print the line, and I also have to explicitly print every other line. I'm using a P because I want to print all of the lines. I only want to modify, in this case, one of them.
Okay, so you let Perl print it or you tell it to print it? I don't see much different.
Well, I usually use -P because I usually want it to print it itself and just make... Usually you end up with just simple S expressions in there. There are a couple of other methods of doing, not in-place edits. The only other way I've found to do in-place edits, true in-place edits, is using things like EX, as in VI's old form, with a here document for the commands you want to run on some other file. So I have done that. That actually works, but it's ugly. And the only other ways I've ever done it were not in-place edits. It's where you create a temp directory, you filter it through to the temp file, and then you move the file into place.
And this one, if you only wanted to change the first line, you could just use $NR for =1.
Oh.
That one I don't remember.
$input line number. If I'm on the first line,
Yeah.
substitute.
Oh. A different pattern. Okay. You're right. Well, no, that's... Does $NR work in Perl as well?
It is handle input line number expression, $input _line number,
Okay,
$NR.
because awk I know has an NR
Yeah, it's all here.
magic value that's automatically set. Yes.
So there's MySQL actually ships a program called userbin that put in there userbin replace, and it doesn't do regular expression handling, but it's the most easy thing I've ever seen to do actual string substitution in files. You just you call it replace, and then first thing you want to change that to.
Right.
Second thing you want to change, second thing you want to change it to hyphen list of files.
Right.
But it's not powerful. The other thing I wanted to mention is Perl is actually about 5 times faster than grep, and sed. That's the side note.
That probably depends a little bit on your version of grep, but
Well, I mean,
it has a heavily optimized regular expression engine, so.
Yeah, I mean, I tested this. I was grepping some Wikipedia data for a separate project a couple months back, and grep took like 10 or 15 minutes to go through the whole gigabyte file dump, and Perl did it in a couple seconds. It was something mind-blowing.
Are you sure
Probably, I am
you're
guessing.
for a second? Because the thing is that you do a grep over the entire kernel, or the Linux kernel source.
Yeah.
The first time it'll take
No.
a few minutes, the second time it'll take seconds.
It was reproducible. It wasn't that problem.
Yeah, on the other hand, the big.
Gigabyte file actually. So.
Yeah. The big thing that might have helped is that Perl might have been grabbing parts of that file in much larger chunks.
Yeah.
If you did an S-trace on it, and this is one of the things I've found out, if you do, there's a dramatic difference between dd if equals dev0, of equals dev HDA, for example, and adding the BS equals 1 meg or 2 meg to that. Because if you do it one way, you do an S-trace, it's actually doing it like a character at a time. Right? That's a whole lot of system calls and a whole lot of non-gathered I.O. that's sitting around. You do it a couple of meg at a time and it'll hammer through that disk in no time.
It's not doing it a block at a time?
Well, no.
You can do the S-trace yourself, but it...
I thought it defaulted to blocks.
Doesn't matter, it's small.
It's much smaller than a couple of meg, yes. I don't remember. I mean, it's doing it small amounts at a time. And if you say BS equals 1, then it really does do it literally 1 character at a time.
Well, yeah, but you're not going to do that.
Depends on the beat.
Yes. Actually, that brings up another thing that I probably should have shown you. There's a trick I use when I have to modify system files in a script. Like one of the scripts I had to do, every time we do a new laptop that we're sending out to a user, there's a bunch of things that we do to that laptop before we send it to them because it's going to be used not on our network. So they can't count on being able to connect to our LDAP and NIST gateways, which means that we have to actually copy their real account into etc password and their real primary group ID into the local group file, make a local directory for them, munge the path of their local copy, etc., etc., etc. So one of the tricks that I do when I'm modifying files like etc password and etc group, and I definitely do not want to have it ever corrupted, is instead of doing in-place edits, which could potentially be broken if you pull the power just at the wrong time. I know it's a laptop, but bear with me for a second. You pull the power, reset the machine just at the wrong time, then you might have a corrupted system file. So what I do is I actually filter it through either Perl or awk as a filter to a temp file, and then I use an ln-f to relink it, because that's an atomic operation. And I do that for each, and I always do it in the same directory, so it's guaranteed to be linkable. In other words, it's on the same file system, so I can use a hard link. So create new file, create the hard link, that implicitly, and I actually usually make an extra link to the backup copy, just in case. So I've done an ln of the old file to a new file name. Then I do an ln of the new file over the ln-f, and that relinks it, but I still have a backup copy.
It's,
but the operation is atomic, so it's safe.
NetBSD's kernel install does that.
Yeah, well, in scripts where I'm modifying important system files, I just do that on every one of them. You know, and it actually in shell scripting, it only takes an extra 1 or 2 lines per file that you're doing this with, so it really doesn't hurt much. And you've already created your temp directory, which I usually try and make my temp directory under the same directory where I'm working. Again, guaranteed to be on the same file system where my other files were, so it's linkable. So, any other new ones?
Yeah, I got some stuff.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things you've talked about, like finds, printf command and stuff, they're very new utils.
That particular one I gave works on any old version of find that you can find.
Printf?
Dash printf has printable parameters in all the versions of find I've ever found.
It's not in
Printf is a
OS
bash command.
They don't have a find on OS 10?
It's not in the man page. I could actually try it.
Yeah, let's try it, actually. I'm kind of curious.
So my question is,
Yeah.
I work on an open source project, which is primarily in Java, but we supply a bunch of SH scripts, you know, to wrap around all this junk. And we absolutely cannot guarantee that they're going to be running bash or any particular version of SH.
Yes. You're in a world of hurt. Yes, I understand.
It's open source, right? So folks are submitting patches that may or may not be bash compliant, and it'll slip through because all of our testing is on Linux. Have you ever seen a validator that says, yeah, this is bash, or this is SH? Or
Debian actually ships a validator for that somewhere in the archive.
And FBSD find does that either.
Yeah, they have, Debian has two different shells that are simpler than bash, that they require that all of the shell scripts be compatible with, to be Debian Lintian compatible, and that's DASH and ASH. So, I mean, like I said, the simplest thing to do is just test everything under ASH. If it works there, then it'll probably work almost always, almost everywhere.
The find dot dash printf gives dash printf unknown expression primary, and it's not in the man page.
Let's see here, but what if I actually gave it an expression? So something like, okay, so
undocumented
not PI.
If you told me that.
But wait, it's really a feature.
That's one thing that I did not actually go into is interactive stuff. Yeah, you're right.
It would have completed
Okay.
on syntax if I just included an expression.
Well, congratulations. The Mac OS 10 find is
It's just
broken.
not on BSD.
The printf isn't on BSD.
It's not on the man page for free on net, and similarly OS X from now. So
Wow.
Maybe
I think it's a
the
BSD thing.
family doesn't have
They have print X and print 0,
They have print 0,
and
but
print
they
X
have,
for X output. They don't have print F.
We're all free BSD servers.
Is that right?
Sorry.
I thought it used to work, but okay.
Interesting if you're fun.
Anyway, yeah, so
I mean,
trying to write scripts which are broadly portable is very difficult. You know, it is a black art, and, you know, unfortunately it's one of the most common arguments for we need to write it in shell so that it'll run everywhere. Yeah, well, if you can actually do it all with built-ins that are supported all the way back to at least ASH, then maybe.
And somebody is
Well,
using the wrong version of that.
Like, for instance, I found out recently that the which command on Solaris does not return a proper exit value if it didn't find whatever the heck you were looking for. Nice. Oh, thank you a lot. So what I ended up having to do is rewrite all of my stuff so that it does the which, captures the output from it, and then does a separate -x, you know, test -x on that thingy to see if there was an executable at that point to whatever which output.
Is that Solaris in general, or is it just that?
I don't remember which version of Solaris it was. It was a bug report on an internal script that I wrote. And I came back and I went, okay, we'll work around it then.
do you ever use type?
Type -p,
Or dash, yeah, or AP or whatever.
for example, the type command in bash is a sort of a super which. It tells you whether it was an internal or built-in, a function, an alias, or prints the path to it. If you say -p, then it's actually, the which command is often just aliased to type -p in bash. So. And for some things, if I have to care about it, then I write some tricky little script test that tells me whether the shell I'm using or the external version of the command I'm using gives me a sane output. And if not, then I try and come up with some convoluted way to get there anyway. I mean, one of the things, and this is another thing I always hate to see when people are using ls in their shell scripts to do things where you really should use find. Right? Where they're trying to find something. Because parsing the ls output leads to a lot of breakage, in my opinion. Yes?
Something I ran into recently, I was writing some scripts that needed to know whether they were interactive or batch mode. And of course, the TTY-S will let you know whether standard in is associated with the terminal. However, to test them, you can fake batch mode by echoing nothing through a pipe and then into your script if it doesn't do anything with standard in, and then standard in will not be associated with the TTY. So you can fake batch mode on the command line.
Of course.
Say it again, sorry.
He was saying that he had some scripts that were testing to see if they were being run interactively or whether they were being run in batch mode. What he found is if you preceded the command, whatever it is, with echo, quote, quote, pipe,
you don't even need
his script, or just echo, well,
Oh, okay,
yeah, if you just echo something into it, then its standard in is no longer the terminal, so it's really not being run interactively.
Can't you look at PS1? That's not defined.
No, because that tells you...
It's not defined as you.
Okay.
Interactive.
It's different to ask, is the current shell, was it started interactively or not? That's different than, is the current shell being run with its standard input attached to a terminal? Because every one of those things that I gave that had started with a shebang line is not an interactive shell, but it was running interactively in the sense that it was running with me sitting there to respond to any prompts that it gave. I mean, when you're doing shell scripting and you want to say, am I being run interactively, then you're asking, can I output some error message and do a read to get some kind of response or a confirmation of some sort to deal with errors, or do I just have to write an error message and punt?
FreeBSD 5.x has the same printf deficiency.
So there's 4 and 6.
That tells you how often I use BSD these days, which is obviously not bloody often. No.
I mean, you don't need printf.
And I have to. Don't need printf. That's a good one. I think the last time I was using BSD, I had installed the GNU utilities on it anyway, which is something that I tend to do pretty early on a lot of machines. So that's not much of an answer for somebody who's trying to maintain a project where he needs broad compatibility.
Why don't you just recompile the GNU utilities in Java or something, and then Java that?
So that's what we're doing. We're doing something simpler. We're just minimizing our shell scripts as much as possible and how we Java thing.
Right. Okay, so it's about 10 till.
First of all, let's thank Jim for coming out and giving us a talk.
And so the question comes up, where are we going to go after the meeting this time? Hint, we're not going to BJ's.
Yeah. So Alan, what's around?
Not a thing.
Not a thing.
Yeah. You gotta go downtown Sunnyvale.
Starbucks will be closed, and it would be too small. And they don't serve beer. Yes.
I do have an announcement. Dolby Laboratories is,
There's a Hobie's
so now
now.
that you've learned all these amazing shell tricks, you can